Oh, hello, it's Shona again, and welcome to our session this month on building a clear and purposeful PowerPoint. I'm going to move really quickly through this PowerPoint because I want to keep our time under 15 minutes, but you'll also see that I sent a PowerPoint checklist that's on one page, and on that checklist is everything that I talk about today that your group can use as you build your PowerPoint over the next few months. And you can use that PowerPoint checklist to make sure you're including everything. And once I see you in workshop 3 in Japan, then we can go over it again. So let's get right to it. Elements of an effective PowerPoint that I can talk about in this session include outlines and structure, what you need to do to make that clear. Talk a little bit about advice on fonts, colors, and background and why that's important in terms of your audience's energy and attention. Graphs and visuals and the impact they can have in your presentation. I'll end up with spelling and grammar before I move to the concluding slide and its relationship to your closing hook that we talked about last month. So starting on slide number 2 with outlines and structure, you want to have an outline of your presentation somewhere within the first 3 slides. Now, of course, that depends on the length of your opening hook. Your opening hook might be several slides. Again, it should come right after your opening hook, and generally it's within the first 3 slides, so your audience knows where you're going. Make sure you follow the order of your outline. So if your audience has a copy of the presentation in front of you, and if you're going off that order, they're going to notice and it's going to distract them. So make sure if you talk about A, B, and C, you talk about A, then B, then C, not A, then C, then B. I've just seen that in fellowship presentations and other presentations, and it can be distracting. And a third point is only place your main points on your outline slide. Do not get into any details at all. Keep it under 4 to 5 words per point and on one line, and that'll keep it clean, professional, and simple. Slide number 3, let's take a look at some simple rules for your PowerPoint outlines. 1 slide per minute of your presentation is a general rule. You can't always stick to this depending on how many visuals you have. For example, this presentation is about 15 minutes and I have 31 slides. However, I move through some of them really quickly, as you'll see a little bit later, and those are the visual ones. So generally speaking, try to stick to this rule, and even if you're not exact, it's going to give you a good indication of how many slides you should have depending on your presentation and what it's about. Use keywords and phrases as I've talked about, point form only. I could have written more on each one of these points, but I'm trying to keep it simple. So these are your speaking points. The PowerPoint are your speaking points as well as a little informational piece to your audience. But remember, your PowerPoint is a tool that supports your presentation. It is not the presentation. Your group members are the presentation and what you're going to talk about, and you want the group speakers to be the focus of the audience, not the PowerPoint itself. And you want to do 5 to 6 points maximum on a slide. Now I want to show you and prove to you why this is the case. How many dots are on this slide? Quickly count them up. Takes the average human about 1.5 to 2 seconds to determine there are 10 dots on this slide. Here's the next one. Takes the average human about 1 to 1.5 seconds to count up there are 7 dots on this slide. Here's our last one. It probably took you a split second to determine that there are 5 dots on this slide, and that's how our brain works. 5 to 6 elements are as much as you want on a slide because it's as much as a human brain can take in without feeling overwhelmed. So I'm hoping that visual representation has proven it to you. This slide says exactly what I've said in the last 4 slides, but look at how wordy it is. Look how you start to read it as the audience member instead of listening to me. This is what happens when you have too much information on a slide. Your audience just gets distracted. They start focusing on the slide and not on you, and that's not what you want. You want the focus to be on you as the compelling presenters of compelling information. Reveal one point at a time, like you've seen me do on each of these slides. It's really important. Why is it important? Because it helps the audience concentrate on what you're saying. If you put all 5 or 6 of your points up all at once, what's going to happen is they're going to be trying to take all of that in instead of concentrating on the one point you're saying. Worse, they're going to start reading ahead. So now they're totally not focused on you and the group, and they're focused on getting through the reading. I don't know what it is, but humans feel the need to read what's on a screen in front of them. Keep them concentrated and focused on what you're saying by revealing only one point at a time. The benefit of this is it's going to help you focus as well. So if you're up there and you're doing part of your presentation and you lose your place, if you've got all 6 points, 5 or 6 points up at once, sometimes it's hard to remind yourself what you need to focus on. So if you've got 1 point at a time, it helps you as a presenter focus as well as your audience. I want to talk just briefly about animations. I know people love animations and they like to get clever and they work really hard on them and they do add interest, but you want to be consistent with them and avoid things like distracting or complicated animation. That starts to be what your audience focuses on versus what you're saying. It also gets really tiring for them because they're wondering what trick you're going to have next. And again, now they're not focused on the content. So it is really, it's attractive, it's, feels exciting to use lots of animations, but it just, again, gets tiring and complicated. Pick one animation and stick with it. There are a number of animations you can choose from. I like to use fade. That's what I use basically throughout this presentation. You don't have to use that one, but if you do pick one, stick with it through the entire presentation. And if you do want to use an animation, only use it once in a 15-minute presentation. If you've got a half-hour presentation, you might want to use 2. It does emphasize the point, but again, if you start to get really clever with them, people start to focus on that and not actually what you're talking about. Let's move on to font, colors, and background. We'll start with font. You want to use at least a 20-point font so that anybody with eyesight problems, vision problems, can see your presentation clearly. Even if it's up on a large screen in a large room, if it's under 20-point font, it can be hard to read. So if you look at these 2 points, they're my main points. And here's a secondary point. It's slightly smaller than the 2 preceding main points, but it's still larger than 20 points. So the secondary point's 22, the main point's 24, and by the way, the title in the blue bar is 40. So the 40 large font tells the audience, okay, here's the theme of this slide, and it's really easy to see. Try to use a standard font. I like Arial. This is what I'm using in this presentation, but Times New Roman also works. Calibri is another one. Whatever you choose, pick one that's just got really clean lines and isn't fancy. Again, it tires the eye and people start to concentrate on the font rather than what you're saying. Here's some examples. If it's too small, your audiences can't read it. If it's capitalized, it's tiring to the eye. Don't use capitals. Don't use a complicated, really bold font. This one's kind of okay, but it's big, it's a little bold, it gets tiring to the eye too. So I really mean this. Don't get too creative with your fonts. Keep them polished, keep them professional, keep them clean. So color is very nice to have in a presentation, but you also want to use a color that, with your writing part, that contrasts with the background. The Unitar template's great because it's blue font on white, and for the title bar, it's white font on blue. Really nice contrast. You don't have to use blue and white, just use colors that contrast beautifully with each other. You can use a color if you want to reinforce your structure, so you could have a darker title and then secondary points that are lighter, but still blue, just a lighter blue. If you do want to use color, only use it occasionally. Also only use bold occasionally. So here I've got the word occasionally in green and bold. And again, in a 15-minute presentation, I might want to do that once, because if you do it too often, it starts to lose its impact. Still on color, you see how yellow is not a good contrast? Just a great example of how a bad contrast is hard to read. Using too many colors is distracting and annoying. You don't need to use a different color for each point. Again, it gets tiring for the eye, distracting and annoying. And trying to be creative is going to be counterproductive. So pick a color, stick with it, and make sure the contrast is great. Use backgrounds that are attractive but simple, like this Unitar template is attractive but very simple. Use backgrounds which are light. Darker backgrounds tend to be more tiring to the eye. And again, use the same background consistently in the presentation. Use a template. Here's a different background, like, whoa, lots of color, really distracting. Hard to read the words on it, and it's not consistent. So use the same background on every single slide in your presentation. This may seem obvious, but I've seen an awful lot of fellowship and other presentations that the slides are different, you know, or they change halfway through. Make sure you use the consistent template. In terms of visuals, graphs and visuals, I want to talk about because you're going to have stats and numbers in your presentations. And Harvard University and a number of other studies have revealed these kinds of things, that people will understand, they'll comprehend only about 7% of information if you just speak about it. But if you add visuals, that comprehension goes up to 87%. Worse, if you only speak about things and don't use great visuals, people will forget 90% of what you said within 30 seconds of you having said it. So visuals allow us to hook memories in our brain, and that's why they're important. So as I mentioned, you're going to have a lot of statistics and numbers in your presentations because you'll be doing research. You want to present them in a simple visual format. I'm going to give you some examples very shortly. You want to limit your information to key statistics and numbers. You don't have to include all of them. And if you're going to use graphs and charts, use them sparingly. In other words, you know, don't use too many of them. Two in your presentation would probably be enough. Here are some examples of effective visuals and ineffective visuals. So here's a nice little chart. Doesn't present too much information. It uses different shades of blue and, you know, gets lighter as it goes down. Really easy to see, not hard for the eye to focus on. Pie charts are really nice. Again, different shades of green. And remember, it's only 5 objects for people to concentrate on. So people's eyes love pie charts. You could also use a simple bar chart. There are only 4 elements in this chart plus the grid lines, so really 5. But this is really easy for people to concentrate on. This one, I always feel like it's kind of on the edge. It could have too much information, but if you highlight, say, the top 2 points with those 2 bold dots, it's a good way to show, you know, a trend, but you're only going to highlight 2 things. So I would really question myself to use this one, but it would be acceptable depending on how you handle it. Now I'm going to show you some bad examples. Too many bars in this chart. Do not use this many bars in a chart. And because we're with a UN agency, we're going to say no in a number of different languages. Too complicated a graphic. You'd have to explain it too much. Don't use it. A schematic like this is again too complicated and tires the eye. Don't use it. Way too much information on org chart structures like this. Don't use it. And an infographic like this, you'd have to explain almost every element, and people are just so overwhelmed by how much information is on here. Don't use bar charts like this. You want to highlight maybe the top 3 things and put it into a simple bar chart like I've already shown you. And this is the world's winner for the last 5 years on worst PowerPoint slide ever. And interestingly, it's from the US Department of Defense about Afghanistan. So again, you don't want to use this stuff. Please, I'm begging you. Absolutely no. Don't use anything this complicated. Visuals, again, have so much impact, and they do absolutely support your point and allow people to remember what you're saying, but you don't want to overdo it. So 1 or 2 visuals to make your point are really add value, but when you start to get too much, you know, we get it. You like frogs. We got the point after 2 pictures. So just be strategic about how you use your visuals. Avoid irrelevant pictures. Be sure they make a point. Like, you might just love this picture and find it entertaining as I do, or maybe you love dinosaurs, but if it doesn't make your point, you need to take it out of your PowerPoint, unless somehow you can tie this to your point. Second last point now, spelling and grammar. Proof your slides. Get someone outside your group, often like maybe your coach, your mentor, someone else, your ARP, because you can get so close to it that you miss spelling mistakes like this one. You miss that you've repeated words like of in this one, and grammatical errors are easy to make. Using this one's got the wrong tense. It should say grammatical errors you might have made. So again, ask someone outside your group just to check in and make sure that everything's polished and professional. And again, I can go over all this with you in workshop 3 in Japan, and we can make sure you've dealt with all of it. And to conclude, your concluding slide should be a summary of the main points that you made. This suggests further research if applicable. If you haven't covered some things, but you know it's important, you just want to let your audience know, yes, I've thought about this and we're going to do further research. Don't confuse your concluding slide with your closing hook. Your closing hook comes last after your concluding slide. And again, that's that call to action. So here's my concluding slide. Today we talked about outlines and structure, fonts, colors, and background, graphs and visuals, spelling and grammar, and finally, what a concluding slide is. And remember, you've got that PowerPoint checklist, so be sure and check it against your PowerPoint over the next few months. Talk to you next month about persuasive techniques.